Our first speaker tonight is Rachel Sayet, who is the Native American Community Development Fellow at the 5 colleges here in the Valley. Rachel will first lead us in a land acknowledgement and will then jump right into her presentation. So I will turn it over to Rachel.
Akwai, greetings. Natasawis Rachel Sayet. Natasawis Akidu Sue. Hello, greetings. My name is Rachel Sayet. My name is Akidu Sue, which means she who reads. I come to you from the Mohegan Nation, and I am the Native American Community Development Fellow here at the 5 colleges, as Kevin just mentioned. So I appreciate that and your introduction. So I'm going to do a quick land acknowledgement and just talk for a few minutes about some modern issues, how they relate to this panel. I acknowledge all the tribes, past and present, of this land that we are on here. UMass Amherst rests on Nonotuck land. The town of Amherst is named after Lord Geoffrey Amherst, a British general who was a leader on dehumanization and genocide of Native peoples. He spread smallpox all over the Northeast. I acknowledge all of our neighboring Indigenous nations, the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and Pequot to the south, the Mohican to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. I myself am a member of the Mohegan Nation, so I'm one of these local tribes here, and all of these other relations are my kinship ties. What I want to say briefly about land acknowledgement is to try to move beyond land acknowledgement. Some of you were able to come to the Native American Indigenous Studies Symposium, which I was helping with back in May. And there was a panel talking about land acknowledgement, and it's definitely important to acknowledge the Native peoples of this land. But when you think about, doing a land acknowledgement or putting one on your email, just make sure you're thinking about also how can you move beyond just taking that step of acknowledging the land and maybe, supporting local Indigenous people, whether it be through buying Native authored books or Indigenous designed clothing or jewelry, or just, helping with issues that you feel like are important, such as the one we're talking about today, the climate change and Indigenous peoples, climate change in UMass, all of these things, finding ways to support. And, if people have questions for me, they can reach out to me directly to ask about ways to kind of, work with Native peoples. It's not always the easiest thing coming from outside a community to, come in with a good intention and know how to engage, because Indigenous peoples throughout history have been, traumatized by people coming inside our communities and recording our stories and our traditions, videoing our ceremonies, all of these things that have caused a lot of problems and trauma. And so it takes a little bit of time to build those relationships. So that's part of my job here at the 5 colleges, is to try to help people understand that it may take a little bit of time, but it's going to be worth it in the long run to build those relationships so that there's a reciprocal relationship, a reciprocal benefit with both the Indigenous communities here and the colleges, and ways to work together that are mutually beneficial in order to heal this past that we're talking about here with Geoffrey Amherst and the legacy here in this town. It's not any easy thing. So in terms of Indigenous people and climate change, it's not my subject of expertise, but I'll talk briefly. I talk a lot about food sovereignty as part of my work. My link to my website just got added to the chat, so thank you, Shana, for that. And I teach about Indigenous foods as well as oral tradition. And the food is specifically related to climate change in many ways, as well as many things that happen on the ground in Indigenous life on the daily throughout this country. But specifically when talking about the foods, there was a poet visiting today here at the 5 colleges who was talking about she can no longer harvest her wild rice from Minnesota to the level that she used to because the water levels are not the same. And because the pipelines are being built and all these other things that are happening on Indigenous land. And so these are issues that, again, we can get involved in as much as we can or as little as we can. Sometimes it's just supporting an artist, to help them. For instance, there was some artists at Standing Rock that were still trying to pay off their jail bond money a couple years ago. And so I was buying a lot of jewelry from them, because that's what happened. They were there protesting, trying to fight for their water, and, they were still paying off that debt, right? So things like that, finding ways that to support, but also can help in this fight we have against climate change and all of the stuff that we're talking about here today. It's all interconnected. Since we are here on Indigenous land, just think about, what are the local communities that I mentioned today, and ways that maybe you can connect, or you need to reach out to me, that's fine, to connect. And we can talk about some of these issues more in depth. So to Butney, thank you so much for having me.